Some mistakes follow you no matter how far you run, and some debts can only be paid with the truth. Avis Darnell knew that better than anyone. For 22 years, she lived alone on her mountain, a woman the town had forgotten. Then, one October morning, she walked into Pine Ridge leading 3 donkeys with burlap sacks tied over their faces. Their backs carried heavy bundles nobody recognized. People whispered. Some thought she'd lost her mind. Others just stared and said nothing. But Avis wasn't lost. She was finally ready to face what she'd been running from all these years. Each donkey carried something from a life she'd tried to bury, and each one would lead her to a place she swore she'd never go back to. What was she carrying? And why now? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The mountain had been Avis Darnell's sanctuary for so long that she'd almost forgotten what it felt like to be seen. At 60 years old, her hands were weathered and capable, her face lined with the kind of creases that come from squinting into wind and sun rather than smiling at neighbors over fences. Her hair, more silver than brown now, she kept pulled back in a single braid that reached halfway down her back. She was lean and strong in the way that people who chop their own wood and carry their own water become strong, not from vanity, but from necessity. Her cabin sat tucked into a clearing about 8 miles up the old logging road, far enough that most folks forgot it was even there. She'd built onto it over the years, adding a shed for tools, a covered area for firewood, a small chicken coop that kept her in eggs through the warmer months. The place wasn't much to look at, but it was hers, and it had asked nothing of her except that she survive. And survive she had, through winters that buried the cabin to its windows, through summers when the creek ran dry and she had to hike 2 miles to the spring, through the long, quiet years when the only voices she heard were her own and the wind moving through the pines. She'd become something other than what she'd been before. Harder, perhaps, but also more honest. Up here, there was no one to lie to, not even herself. But honesty, she'd learned, was a double-edged thing. It cut both ways. The town of Pine Ridge hadn't changed much in the years since she'd left. Oh, there were some new buildings, some old ones torn down, but the bones of the place remained the same. The general store still occupied the corner of Main and Cedar. Though old Howard Pike had passed on, and his daughter ran it now, the post office still sat across from the diner, and the sheriff's office still had that same crooked step out front that nobody ever fixed. Avis knew these things because she came down from the mountain 3, maybe 4 times a year for supplies she couldn't grow or make herself. She came early, just after dawn, and she kept her visits short. She spoke to people only when necessary, paid in cash, and was back on the trail before most folks finished their morning coffee. She'd perfected the art of being invisible in plain sight. The people who remembered her from before, and there were fewer of those every year, they'd look at her sometimes with a mixture of curiosity and discomfort, like they were trying to match the woman in front of them with the girl she'd been. Most didn't try. It was easier to treat her like a stranger, and Avis preferred it that way. But there were a few who remembered everything. Hank Jessup, who ran the hardware store, had been in her class at school. He'd had a crush on her once, back when such things mattered. Now he just nodded when she came in, filled her orders without comment, and took her money with hands that shook slightly from age or something else. His eyes, though, his eyes still held questions he'd never ask. And then there was Pauline Mercer, who owned the diner and had been her sister's best friend. Pauline was the only one who'd ever tried to talk to her, really talk, about what happened. She'd cornered Avis in the general store once, about 10 years back, and said, "Your sister asks about you, you know. Even now. Even after everything." Avis had walked away without answering. Some conversations were too dangerous to have. The donkeys came into her life by accident, or what she'd thought was accident at the time. 3 years ago, she'd been coming back from one of her supply runs when she found them standing in the middle of the old logging road, looking bewildered and half-starved. They'd escaped from a ranch down in the valley, she later learned, and had wandered up into the high country looking for food. The owner never came looking, so Avis kept them. She named them after her 3 favorite trees: aspen, cedar, and pine. Aspen was the smallest, a grey jenny with a white nose and gentle eyes. Cedar was the stubborn one, a dark brown jack who had opinions about everything and wasn't shy about expressing them. Pine was the oldest, a large, patient gelding who seemed to understand that life was long and most things weren't worth getting worked up about. They'd become her companions in a way she hadn't expected. She talked to them while she worked, told them things she'd never tell another human being. They didn't judge, didn't ask questions, just listened with their large ears swiveling toward her voice. In return, she cared for them with a devotion that surprised her, keeping them fed through the winter, tending their hooves, making sure they had shelter when the weather turned mean. She'd never imagined they'd become part of this journey. But then, she'd never imagined she'd make this journey at all. The photograph in her pocket was old enough that the edges had worn soft. She'd carried it for so long that she sometimes forgot it was there. But then her hand would brush against it, and she'd remember. In the picture, she was 23 years old, standing between 3 people who'd meant everything to her once. Her husband, James, tall and solid, his arm around her waist. Her son, barely visible as a small bundle in her arms, just 3 months old. And her sister, standing close on her other side, smiling that bright, trusting smile that had always come so easy to her. The photograph had been taken on a Sunday afternoon in May. She remembered the smell of apple blossoms and fresh-cut grass. She remembered feeling, for just that moment, like her life might actually turn out all right. Like she might be capable of the things other women seemed to do without thinking. Love their children, keep their promises, stay. 6 months later, she was gone. She'd spent 22 years trying not to think about what she'd left behind, training herself to focus only on what was in front of her. The next meal, the next cord of wood to split, the next winter to survive. But the photograph remained, pressed against her heart, a small, sharp reminder that some things can't be escaped just by climbing high enough into the mountains. The letter had arrived on a Tuesday in late September, carried up the mountain by a young man from the county office who looked both proud and terrified to have found her. She'd been splitting wood when she saw him coming up the trail, sweating and panting from the climb. He'd handed her the envelope with an official seal on it, waited while she signed for it, then practically ran back down the mountain like he was afraid she might hex him or something. The letter was from a lawyer in Pine Ridge. She'd read it 3 times before the words really sank in, standing there with the axe still in her hand and wood chips scattered around her feet. Her sister was dead. Pneumonia, it said, quick and unexpected. The funeral had been 2 weeks ago. There were matters to settle, belongings to distribute, and Avis was named in the will. She'd sat down on the chopping block and stared at the tree line until the sun went down and the temperature dropped and her hands went numb. Her sister was dead. The person she'd wronged most in the world was dead, and there was no making it right now. No apology to give, no explanation to offer. Just absence and finality, and the cold October air pressing against her skin. That night, she'd lain awake in her cabin while the wind rattled the windows and mice scratched in the walls. She'd thought about her sister as a child, 6 years younger, always tagging along, always trusting that Avis would protect her, guide her, be the person she needed. She'd thought about the promises she'd made and broken, the lies she'd told, the betrayal that had driven her up this mountain and kept her here. And she'd thought about the 3 people she'd left behind, each one carrying a piece of her absence like a stone in their pocket. Her son, who would be 23, now, older than she'd been when she'd left him. Her husband, who'd been nothing but good to her and had deserved better than abandonment. And her sister, who'd sacrificed everything and never asked for thanks. By the time the sun came up, she'd made her decision. She would go back. She would face what she'd done. And she would try, however inadequately, to give each of them something that explained, if not excused, why she'd disappeared. It took her 2 weeks to prepare. She gathered the things she needed, wrapped them carefully, distributed them among 3 packs. She sewed the burlap sacks herself, working by lamplight, her fingers remembering skills she'd learned as a girl. She planned her route, calculating distances and overnight stops, remembering landmarks from her rare trips down the mountain. And then, on an October morning with frost on the ground and her breath making clouds in the air, she'd loaded the 3 donkeys, covered their faces with the burlap sacks, and started down the trail toward Pine Ridge. The sacks served a practical purpose. They'd keep the donkeys calm, prevent them from shying at unfamiliar sights and sounds. But they also felt appropriate somehow, symbolic. She was asking these animals to carry burdens they couldn't see or understand, just as the people in her life had carried the burden of her choices without ever knowing the full truth of why. When she reached the edge of town that morning, she'd seen the stares, heard the whispers. Someone called out, asking if she needed help. She'd shaken her head and kept walking, leading the donkeys through the main street with her eyes straight ahead, feeling the weight of every gaze on her back. Let them wonder, she thought. Let them talk. She'd be gone again soon enough, back to her mountain, where other people's opinions couldn't reach her. But first, she had 3 stops to make, 3 debts to acknowledge, even if she could never fully pay them. The hardest part would be deciding whether to reveal herself or remain anonymous, whether to face the people she'd hurt or leave her offerings like a ghost, there and gone before anyone could ask questions. She hadn't decided yet. Maybe she'd know when the time came. Maybe she'd lose her courage and run again. But this time, at least, she was walking toward her past instead of away from it. And for Avis Darnell, that was something close to brave. The letter had arrived exactly 17 days before Avis walked into Pine Ridge with the 3 blindfolded donkeys. She remembered the exact number because she'd counted each day like a prisoner, marking time on a cell wall, each one bringing her closer to a decision she didn't want to make. The young courier had appeared on her trail just after noon on that September Tuesday, looking red-faced and determined. She'd been tending her garden, pulling up the last of the carrots before the hard frost came, when she'd heard the sound of boots on gravel. Visitors were rare enough that her first instinct was to reach for the rifle she kept leaning against the cabin wall. But then she'd seen the official county vehicle parked down where the trail met what passed for a road, and she'd known this wasn't danger, at least not the kind that could be stopped with a gun. "Miss Darnell?" The young man had pulled an envelope from his canvas bag, consulting a piece of paper to make sure he had the right name. "Got a registered letter for you. Need you to sign." She'd taken the pen he offered, scrawled her name on his clipboard, and accepted the envelope with hands that were still dirty from the garden. The return address was from Whitfield and Associates, attorneys at law, Pine Ridge. Her stomach had tightened even before she opened it. The young man had lingered for a moment, perhaps hoping for conversation or a glass of water, but Avis had already turned away, and he'd gotten the message. She'd heard him making his way back down the trail, breathing hard from the altitude and the climb. She'd stood there for a long time with the envelope in her hand, listening to the jays arguing in the pines and the creek running over stones below the cabin. The sun was warm on her shoulders, and the air smelled like pine sap and the first hint of autumn cold. Everything felt normal, ordinary, the kind of afternoon that usually brought her peace. But the envelope was heavy, and she knew, the way you know some things in your bones before your mind catches up, that normal was about to end. Inside the cabin, she'd sat at her rough wooden table and opened the letter with her pocket knife, careful not to tear the contents. The paper was expensive, cream-colored, with the law firm's letterhead embossed at the top. The language was formal, full of legal terms that took her a moment to pass. But the essential facts were simple and brutal. Her sister Lorraine had died on September 3rd. Pneumonia, complicated by a weak heart that no one had known about. She'd been gone for 3 days before anyone found her, alone in the house where she'd lived for 40 years, the same house where they'd both grown up. The funeral had been held on September 9th. A large turnout, the letter noted, as if that might matter to Avis, as if attendance at a funeral could measure the worth of a life. But that wasn't the part that had made Avis's hands shake as she held the paper. The part that had done that came 2 paragraphs later, in language that was probably meant to be neutral and professional, but felt like a hand reaching up from the grave to grab her by the throat. As executor of Ms. Lorraine Darnell's estate, I am obligated to inform you that you are named as a beneficiary in her last will and testament. In addition to a financial bequest, you have been left personal effects, which Ms. Darnell specified in her instructions should be delivered to you directly, along with a sealed letter marked, "To be opened by Avis alone." Per the deceased's wishes, these items have been held pending your response. Please contact this office at your earliest convenience to arrange for collection or delivery. Avis had read those words 5 times before setting the letter down. Then she'd walked outside and stood at the edge of the clearing, staring out at the mountains that had been her fortress for more than 2 decades, and she'd felt something crack inside her chest, something that had been frozen solid for so long she'd forgotten it was there. Lorraine was dead. Her baby sister, who'd been 12 years old when Avis left, who'd looked at her with such trust and admiration, who'd believed everything Avis told her, gone, dead and buried while Avis had been up here in the mountains, oblivious, living her small, protected life. The grief came first, immediate and sharp. Then the guilt, which was worse because it was familiar. Guilt was an old companion, something Avis had learned to live with the way you learn to live with chronic pain. But this was different. This was final. There would be no chance now to explain, to apologize, to ask for forgiveness that she knew she didn't deserve, but had always hoped might someday be offered anyway. She'd spent that evening sitting on her porch as the sun set and the temperature dropped, wrapped in a blanket, not moving even when the cold made her bones ache. The letter sat on the table inside, but she could feel its presence like a weight pressing on her chest. A sealed letter, marked for her alone. What could Lorraine possibly have to say after all these years? What words could bridge the gap between them, span the distance that Avis had created and maintained with such determined thoroughness? That night, she hadn't slept. She'd lain in her narrow bed and watched the moon cross the window, thinking about the last time she'd seen her sister. Lorraine had been at school, probably in math class or maybe lunch. Avis had packed a single bag that morning, moving quickly and quietly through the house, while James was at work. And the baby, little Thomas, was at her mother's for the day. She'd walked out the door at 10 in the morning and never gone back. She hadn't said goodbye, hadn't left a note, except for a brief message to James that explained nothing. "I can't do this anymore. Don't look for me." She'd taken the bus as far as it went, then hitchhiked to the mountains, found this cabin abandoned and half collapsed, and started the process of disappearing. She'd told herself at the time that she was doing everyone a favor, that they'd be better off without her, that she was broken in some fundamental way, incapable of being the wife and mother and sister they deserved. She'd convinced herself that a clean break was kinder than watching her fail slowly, watching her damage them piece by piece with her inadequacy. But lying there in the dark, 22 years later, with news of her sister's death pressing down on her like a physical weight, Avis could see her, reasoning for what it had been: cowardice dressed up as sacrifice, self-protection masquerading as selflessness. She'd run because staying was hard, and up here in the mountains, alone, she only had to worry about keeping herself alive. No one else could be disappointed in her if there was no one else around. The next morning, she'd forced herself to eat breakfast, though everything tasted like dust. She'd gone about her chores, feeding the chickens, checking the donkeys, splitting more wood for winter. She'd tried to fall back into her routine, the familiar rhythms that had sustained her for so long. But everything felt wrong now, off balance, like a picture hanging crooked on a wall. 3 days passed before she made the trip down to the general store to use the phone. She'd called the lawyer's office, spoken to a secretary with a kind voice who'd said Mr. Whitfield would be happy to arrange delivery of the items from Lorraine's estate. She'd given them her post office box number in Pine Ridge, the one she checked every few months, and hung up quickly before any more questions could be asked. The package arrived a week later. She'd brought it back to the cabin unopened, set it on the table, and stared at it for an entire day before finding the courage to cut the tape. Inside was a smaller, sealed envelope, addressed in her sister's handwriting. Seeing that familiar script, still round and careful, the way Lorraine had learned to write in elementary school, had brought tears to Avis's eyes for the first time since she'd gotten the news. But she hadn't opened that letter. Not yet. Next to it in the package was a small wooden box, old and worn. Inside that, wrapped in tissue paper, she'd found a collection of things that didn't make immediate sense. A child's silver bracelet with tiny bells, a photograph of their mother she'd never seen before, a pressed flower, so old it crumbled at the edges, and at the bottom, carefully folded, a birth certificate. Avis had picked up that birth certificate with trembling hands. The paper was official, stamped and signed, dated March 15th, 39 years ago. Mother's name, Lorraine Darnell. Father's name, listed as unknown. Child's name, Stella Rose Darnell. And suddenly, everything made terrible, perfect sense. The room had seemed to tilt around her. She'd set the birth certificate down carefully, then sat in her chair and put her head in her hands, breathing through the wave of shock and recognition that threatened to pull her under. Stella. Her sister had named the baby Stella. The memories came flooding back, unstoppable now that the dam had broken. She'd been 17 years old, scared and pregnant, and certain her life was over. This was 1986. Things were different then, especially in small towns where everyone knew everyone, and mistakes like hers were marked in permanent ink. Her parents had been furious, ashamed, determined to hide the scandal. There was talk of sending her away, but that cost money they didn't have. And then Lorraine, sweet 12-year-old Lorraine, had overheard them arguing one night. She'd come to Avis's room afterward and held her hand and said, "I'll help you, whatever you need." At 12 years old, she'd said that, and she'd meant it. The plan had formed slowly. Avis would have the baby at home, with a midwife who could be trusted to be discreet. Lorraine would help care for the infant, and they'd tell people the baby was a cousin's child being fostered temporarily. Then, when enough time had passed, when Avis had figured out what to do, they'd been vague about that part, the way teenagers are about the future. But Avis had never figured it out. She'd held that tiny baby girl for 3 days, loved her fiercely and desperately, and then realized she had no idea how to be a mother. She was 17, hadn't finished high school, had no job, no prospects, no support. The baby's father was long gone, a boy from the next town over who'd wanted nothing to do with her once he found out. On the 4th day, she'd placed the baby in Lorraine's arms and said, "You take her. You raise her. Tell everyone she's yours." Lorraine had been too young to understand what that meant, but she'd nodded anyway, solemn and serious, treating the request like a sacred trust. Their parents had gone along with it, relieved, probably, to have a solution that didn't involve ongoing shame. They'd worked out the legal fiction. Lorraine was too young to be the mother, obviously, so they'd claimed the baby was a distant relative's child that they were adopting. Somehow, maybe through money or connections or just small-town willingness to look the other way, they'd managed to get paperwork that listed Lorraine as the mother. Irregular, probably illegal, but done. And Avis had watched her daughter grow for 6 years before she couldn't stand it anymore. Watched Stella call Lorraine Mama. Watched her sister become the mother Avis couldn't be. Until the guilt and the grief and the unbearable wrongness of it all had driven her to marry the first decent man who asked, have another baby she also couldn't love properly, and then finally flee to these mountains where nothing was asked of her except survival. She'd left behind a son and a husband, and a sister raising her daughter as her own. 3 people who deserved better than her cowardice, 3 debts she could never repay. But now Lorraine was dead, and the secret she'd kept for 39 years was sitting on Avis's table in the form of a birth certificate and an unopened letter. And Avis realized that whatever peace she'd found up here in the mountains had always been an illusion. You couldn't run from the people you'd failed. They followed you whether you wanted them to or not. That night, by lamplight, she'd finally opened her sister's letter. She'd read it twice, crying so hard she could barely see the words. And when she was done, she'd known exactly what she had to do, even if the doing of it terrified her more than anything she'd ever faced. She would go back. She would make 3 stops, deliver 3 burdens, face 3 people whose lives she'd irrevocably altered. She didn't expect forgiveness. She didn't even expect understanding. But she would finally, after 22 years, stop running and stand still long enough to let the truth catch up to her. The 3 donkeys would carry what needed to be carried, and Avis would walk behind them, no longer hiding in the mountains, finally willing to be seen. The journey began before dawn on that October morning, with frost glittering on the ground and Avis's breath making clouds in the cold air. She'd spent the previous day preparing, packing the donkeys with careful deliberation, wrapping each item in canvas and oilcloth to protect it from weather. The wooden toy horse went into Aspen's pack, cushioned with old blankets. The wedding ring, threaded on its chain, she placed in Cedar's saddlebag, tucked inside a small leather pouch. Pine, the largest and steadiest of the 3, carried the heaviest burden: the quilt, the journal, the birth certificate, and her sister's letter, which she'd read so many times now that she had it memorized. The burlap sacks had taken her 3 evenings to sew. She'd cut them from old feed bags, double-stitching the seams to make sure they wouldn't tear. They fit over each donkey's head like oversized hoods, covering their eyes, but leaving their nostrils and ears clear. The donkeys had protested at first, Cedar especially, tossing his head and trying to shake the covering loose. But she'd gentled them with handfuls of oats and soft words, and eventually they'd settled, standing patient and resigned while she secured the sacks with soft rope that wouldn't chafe. "I'm sorry," she'd whispered to each of them. "I know you don't understand, but I need you to trust me." They'd started down the trail single file, Avis leading Aspen with Pine and Cedar following behind, their lead ropes tied to the pack saddles in front of them. The donkeys moved carefully, testing each step, their heads lowered as they compensated for their lack of vision. Avis kept the pace slow, talking to them constantly, warning them of obstacles, guiding them around rocks and roots. The trail down from her cabin was one she'd walked hundreds of times, but it felt different now, sharper somehow, more real. Every landmark seemed significant: the lightning-struck pine that marked the halfway point, the creek crossing where she always stopped to let the donkeys drink, the clearing where she'd once seen a black bear feeding on service berries. She was leaving her sanctuary, descending back into the world she'd fled, and each step took her further from safety. By mid-morning, they'd reached the lower elevation where the pines gave way to mixed forest, aspen and birch and cottonwood, their leaves already turned gold and orange with the season. The air was warmer, here, less thin, and Avis found herself breathing harder, even though the trail had leveled out. It wasn't the altitude making her breathless now. It was fear. She'd chosen to pass through Pine Ridge in the early morning because fewer people would be out, fewer questions to deflect. But she'd miscalculated slightly, and by the time they reached Main Street, the town was beginning to stir. Lights were on in the diner, a delivery truck was parked outside the general store, and people were starting to notice the strange procession. A weather-worn woman leading 3 blindfolded donkeys through the center of town. Avis kept her eyes forward and her pace steady. She heard the whispers starting, saw people stopping to stare. Someone called out. She thought it might have been Hank from the hardware store, but she didn't turn, didn't acknowledge. She just kept walking, leading her small caravan through the streets where she'd once belonged, now a stranger in the place that had been her home. "Is that Avis Darnell?" The voice was female, uncertain, coming from somewhere to her left. Can't be. She never comes down anymore, except for supplies. Why are the donkeys covered like that? Maybe they're sick or something. Maybe she's taking them to a vet. Avis let the speculation wash over her. Let them wonder. Let them talk. She'd be gone soon enough, and their curiosity would fade into the background noise of small-town gossip. One more strange thing that happened once, and was mostly forgotten. What mattered was the journey ahead, not the audience witnessing its beginning. They cleared the town limits by 7:30 and turned onto the county road that led east toward the valley where her son lived. The morning sun was bright now, warming her shoulders through her jacket. The donkeys seemed to relax once they left the pavement behind, their hooves finding easier purchase on the dirt road. Avis let herself fall into the rhythm of walking, one foot in front of the other, the familiar motion that had carried her through 22 years of mountain life. By midday, they'd reached the turnoff to the old mining road. This was territory Avis knew less well, and she stopped to consult the map she'd drawn from memory and old surveys she'd found in the library years ago. The road was rougher here, barely maintained, but it would take her where she needed to go, a small settlement called Ridgeway, about 15 miles east of Pine Ridge, where her son had made his home. She found a spot to rest by a creek, tied the donkeys to a sturdy aspen, and removed their burlap sacks so they could drink and graze. They seemed grateful, shaking their heads and blinking in the sudden light. Cedar immediately found a patch of grass and began eating with single-minded determination. Aspen nuzzled Avis's shoulder, looking for treats, while Pine simply stood and surveyed the landscape with his usual calm dignity. Avis sat on a flat rock and pulled out the lunch she'd packed: bread and hard cheese, an apple, a canteen of water. She wasn't particularly hungry, but she forced herself to eat anyway. The journey ahead would require strength, and there was no room for the weakness that came from skipping meals or giving in to nerves. She was chewing the last of the apple when she heard footsteps on the trail behind her. She turned, instinctively defensive, and saw a young man coming around the bend. 20s, maybe early 30s, wearing expensive hiking boots and carrying a pack that looked like it had cost more than Avis spent in 6 months. "Hey there," he called out, friendly and oblivious to her desire for solitude. "Beautiful day, isn't it?" Avis nodded, but didn't speak, hoping he'd take the hint and move on. But he stopped when he saw the donkeys, his face lighting up with curiosity. "Are those donkeys? Man, that's so cool. I didn't know people still used pack animals around here." He gestured to the burlap sacks lying on the ground. "What are those for?" "They're for the donkeys," Avis said, her tone deliberately flat. "Yeah, but what do they do? Are they blinders or something?" Avis considered her answer. She could tell him to mind his own business. She could lie. Or she could tell him just enough of the truth to satisfy his curiosity without revealing anything that mattered. "They keep the animals calm," she said finally. "When you're traveling through unfamiliar territory, sometimes it's better if they can't see everything around them. Keeps them from spooking." The young man nodded like this made perfect sense to him, though Avis suspected he had no real understanding of animals or what they needed. "That's really interesting. Are you a guide or something? Do you do wilderness tours?" "No." "Oh, well, cool setup anyway." He hesitated, perhaps sensing that he wasn't welcome, but not quite ready to abandon the conversation. "You headed far?" "Far enough." "Right, cool. Well, have a good one." He gave her an awkward wave and continued up the trail, glancing back once before disappearing around a curve. Avis waited until she was certain he was gone before standing and gathering the burlap sacks. She replaced them over the donkeys' heads, working quickly and efficiently, then shouldered her own small pack and took up Aspen's lead rope. Time to move again. The longer she stayed in one place, the more likely she was to lose her nerve. The afternoon wore on, hot and bright. They passed through a stretch of open meadow where the grass was golden and dry, rustling in the breeze. The mountains rose on all sides, their peaks already dusted with early snow. Hawks circled overhead, riding the thermals, and somewhere in the distance, Avis heard the bugling of an elk. Fall was the season of preparation, everything in the natural world getting ready for winter's hardships. It seemed fitting that she was making this journey now, in this season of endings and readiness. By evening, they reached a spot she'd marked on her map, a clearing near a spring, sheltered by rock outcroppings that would provide some protection if the weather turned. She made camp efficiently, tying the donkeys where they could reach both water and grass, removing their face coverings for the night, building a small fire for warmth and comfort more than necessity. She sat by the fire as darkness fell, watching sparks spiral up into the night sky. Somewhere out there, perhaps 30 miles away, her son was living his life, a life she knew almost nothing about. Did he have a family? A job he loved? Did he ever think about the mother who'd abandoned him when he was barely old enough to remember her face? Tomorrow, she would find out. Tomorrow, she would see the man her baby boy had become, and she would leave him a gift that couldn't possibly make up for her absence, but might at least tell him he'd been remembered. That he'd always been remembered, even if she'd been too broken to show it. She pulled out the wooden toy horse from Aspen's pack, unwrapping it carefully. She'd made it herself when Thomas was born, carved it from a piece of pine during the long nights when he'd slept and she'd been too anxious to rest. She'd painted it with whatever colors she could find, blue and white and touches of red. It was crude work, the work of someone with more love than skill, but it was hers. She'd left it behind when she fled, along with everything else, but somehow it had survived, stored away in a box of baby things that someone, probably her mother, had saved. Her sister's letter had mentioned it. I kept some of Thomas's things from when he was little. I thought maybe someday you'd want them, or maybe he would. I'm sending this one because I remember you making it. I remember you holding him and showing him the horse, trying to make him smile. I want you to know that even though you left, that moment was real. That love was real, even if you couldn't hold on to it. Avis traced the worn paint with her thumb. That love was real. The question was whether Thomas would believe it, whether a wooden horse and a silent appearance could communicate what 22 years of absence had said so clearly. She wrapped it again and placed it back in the pack. Then she spread her bedroll near the fire, pillowed her head on her jacket, and stared up at the stars until exhaustion finally pulled her down into restless sleep. In her dreams, she was young again, holding a baby boy and trying desperately to remember how to feel like a mother. But every time she looked down at his face, he was older, 5, 10, 15, aging before her eyes while she stood frozen, unable to speak or move or do anything except watch him grow into a stranger. She woke before dawn with tears on her face and the certainty that no gift, however heartfelt, would ever be enough. The second day of walking brought her into different country, lower, warmer, with rolling hills instead of mountains and farmland spreading out in patches between stands of timber. Ridgeway appeared on the horizon by mid-morning, a small collection of houses and buildings clustered around a crossroads. It was bigger than Pine Ridge, but still small enough that everyone probably knew everyone else's business, that weddings and funerals drew the whole town, that a stranger arriving would be noticed and discussed. Avis skirted the main part of town, following the directions she'd memorized from the phone book she'd consulted during one of her supply runs months ago. Thomas Darnell, 447 Maple Ridge Road. The address had been easy to find. There was only one T. Darnell listed, and she'd recognized the last name she'd given him, the name he'd carried even after she'd disappeared. Maple Ridge Road turned out to be a gravel lane that wound through a neighborhood of modest homes on large lots, the kind of place where people kept vegetable gardens and chickens, where children played in yards and dogs barked at passing cars. Normal. Safe. The kind of place Avis had never managed to create, the kind of life she'd never been able to live. She found number 447 at the end of the lane, set back from the road behind a row of young maples that someone had planted deliberately, probably when the house was built. It was a simple ranch-style home with blue siding and white trim, well-maintained but not showy. A small barn or large shed stood behind it, a vegetable garden, mostly harvested for the season, occupied one side of the yard, and in the driveway sat a pickup truck with a lumber company logo on the door. Avis stopped at the edge of the property, staying back in the tree line where she wouldn't be immediately visible. The donkeys shuffled behind her, patient under their coverings, waiting to see what would happen next. Her heart was beating so hard she could feel it in her throat, and her hands were shaking as she reached up to adjust Aspen's pack. She'd debated with herself all night about whether to approach directly or leave the gift anonymously. Standing here now, looking at her son's home, the decision made itself. She couldn't face him, couldn't stand in front of the child she'd abandoned and try to explain the unexplainable. What would she even say? "I'm sorry I left. I thought you'd be better off without me. I was broken and scared and too much of a coward to stay." None of it would matter. None of it would change what she'd done or give him back the mother he'd deserved. She'd leave the horse and go. That was the plan. She'd wait until she was sure no one was watching, place it somewhere he'd find it, and disappear back into the wilderness before questions could be asked. It was the coward's way, but she'd accepted long ago that cowardice was part of who she was. She settled in to watch, tying the donkeys to trees where they could reach some grass, removing their coverings so they wouldn't overheat in the morning sun. Then she found a spot behind a large boulder where she could observe the house without being seen. An hour passed. 2. The sun climbed higher, warming the air, burning off the last of the morning chill. Avis ate some of the jerky she'd brought, drank sparingly from her canteen. The donkeys dozed, switching their tails at flies. Nothing moved at the house except a cat that appeared on the porch, stretched, and settled into a patch of sunlight. Then, around noon, the front door opened, and a man stepped out. Avis's breath caught. 23 years old now, tall and solid, with dark hair and a way of moving that reminded her painfully of his father. He was wearing work clothes, jeans and a flannel shirt, and he carried a lunch pail in one hand. He walked to the truck, moving with the easy confidence of someone who knew his place in the world, who had work to do and the capability to do it. Thomas, her son, a man now, living a life she knew nothing about. She watched him start the truck, back out of the driveway, and head down the road. Going to work, probably, a lunch shift or afternoon job. She had no idea what he did, whether he was happy, whether he'd found someone to love him better than she ever had. She waited another 20 minutes after he left, making sure he wasn't coming back for something forgotten. Then she moved quickly, pulling the wooden horse from Aspen's pack and crossing the open ground to the house. Her hands were still shaking, her chest felt tight, but she forced herself to keep moving, to not stop and think about what she was doing, or she'd lose her nerve entirely. The porch was clean and well swept. A mat by the door said, "Welcome," in cheerful letters. Avis placed the wooden horse on the mat, positioning it carefully so it wouldn't roll or blow away. She'd wrapped it in cloth, tied with string, with no note, no explanation. He'd know what it was. She had to believe he'd know. She was turning to leave when she heard a sound from inside the house, footsteps moving toward the door. Someone else was home. She froze for a fraction of a second, then made a decision that felt both inevitable and terrifying. Instead of running, she knocked. The door opened to reveal a young woman, maybe 30, with kind eyes and flour on her hands. "Can I help you?" Avis's voice came out rough, and she had to clear her throat and try again. "I have something for Thomas Darnell. Is this the right house?" "It is." The woman looked curious but not suspicious. "He's at work right now, but I can give him a message if you'd like. I'm his wife, Lily. Wife. Her son was married. Avis felt something twist in her chest. Joy and grief mixed together so tightly she couldn't separate them. No message, Avis managed. Just this. She gestured to the wrapped horse at their feet. If you could make sure he gets it. Lily looked down, noticed the package for the first time. Oh, of course. Can I tell him who it's from? Avis was already backing away, shaking her head. He'll know. Or he won't. Either way is all right. Wait. Lily took a step forward, but Avis had already turned and was walking quickly back toward the tree line, her heart pounding, her eyes blurring with tears. She refused to let fall until she was safely out of sight. She heard Lily call after her once more, but she didn't turn around, didn't slow down. She reached the donkeys, replaced their coverings with trembling hands, and led them back onto the road, moving as fast as she dared without making the animals stumble. She'd done it. She'd delivered the first gift, faced the first piece of her past. It hadn't brought redemption or absolution, but it was done, and she couldn't undo it now even if she wanted to. When she was a mile down the road, and certain no one had followed, she finally stopped and let herself cry. Great, gasping sobs that came from somewhere deep inside her chest, from a place that had been locked away for so long she'd almost forgotten it existed. The donkeys stood patient and still while she wept, their covered faces turned toward her like they were listening, like they understood that some burdens were too heavy to carry silently. When the tears finally stopped, she wiped her face on her sleeve and took a deep breath of the clean autumn air. 1 down, 2 to go. The hardest parts were still ahead, but she'd made a start, and that was something. She consulted her map. The next destination was perhaps 40 miles west, a longer journey through more populated areas. She'd need to camp at least 1 more night, maybe 2, before she reached the town where her former husband lived. She had time to think about what she'd say to him, assuming she found the courage to say anything at all. The wedding ring felt heavy in Cedar's pack, heavier than its actual weight could account for. It had been her grandmother's originally, passed down to her mother, and then to her on her wedding day. James had slipped it on her finger in a small ceremony at the courthouse, just the 2 of them and 2 witnesses pulled in from the street. She'd been 3 months pregnant with Thomas. He'd been 21 years old and earnest, and determined to do the right thing, even though they barely knew each other. She'd loved him, she thought. Or she'd tried to. But trying wasn't the same as succeeding, and after a while, the weight of trying had become unbearable. When she'd left, she'd taken the ring with her. Not because she wanted it, but because removing it and leaving it behind felt too final, too much like admitting she was never coming back. She'd worn it for the first few months in the mountains, even though there was no one to see it. Then one day, she'd taken it off and put it on a chain around her neck, hidden under her shirt. Then eventually she'd put it away entirely, wrapped it in cloth, and tried not to think about what it represented. Now it was going back to him. Not as an apology. Nothing could apologize for what she'd done. But as an acknowledgement, a closing of a circle that had been left incomplete for too long. The afternoon stretched into evening, and Avis pushed on, covering more ground than she'd planned. She wanted distance between herself and Ridgway, between herself and the moment when Lily would give Thomas the package, and he'd unwrap it and find a toy horse from his infancy. She didn't want to imagine his face when he realized what it meant, who it must have come from. Didn't want to think about whether he'd feel anything at all, or if her gesture would just seem pathetic, too little and far too late. She made camp that night in a state park campground, paying the small fee to the ranger and setting up in a designated spot far from the other campers. She let the donkeys graze without their coverings, built a careful fire in the metal ring provided, and heated a can of beans for her dinner. The normalcy of it felt strange after the intensity of the day, like she was play-acting at being a regular person on a regular camping trip, when really she was a ghost moving through the world, trying to make peace with the living. That night, she pulled out the ring and held it up to the firelight, watching it catch and reflect the flames. Such a small thing, such a weight. Tomorrow she'd keep walking, and the day after that, if she didn't lose her nerve, she'd find James and return what had never really been hers to take. The town where James lived was called Coopersville, and Avis reached its outskirts on the afternoon of the 4th day. Her feet ached, her shoulders were sore from the pack she carried, and the donkeys were moving slower, tired from the long miles. They'd camped rough the night before. No official campground, just a clearing off the main road where Avis had judged they wouldn't be disturbed. She'd slept poorly, waking every few hours to check on the animals and stare up at the stars, trying to find courage she wasn't sure she possessed. Coopersville was larger than Ridgeway, a proper town with a main street that had actual stores rather than just a general goods place and a gas station. There was a library, a proper grocery store, even a small movie theater, the kind of place where a person could build a real life, put down roots, maybe even be happy. She'd learned through careful research during her infrequent trips to use the library computer that James had moved here about 10 years ago. Before that, he'd stayed in Pine Ridge, presumably hoping she'd come back. When it became clear she wouldn't or couldn't, he'd finally let go and started over. She didn't blame him. In fact, she respected him for it. He'd done what she'd been too weak to do, accepted reality and moved forward. According to the public records she'd found, he owned a small workshop on the edge of town where he did custom woodworking and furniture repair. The address was 1847 Industrial Way, Unit C. She'd memorized it, along with all the other details she'd gathered like pieces of a puzzle she was trying to solve. His age, now 44, his lack of remarriage, unless he'd done it very recently and it hadn't made it into any public records, his apparent success at his business. The shop had been featured in a local newspaper article about craftsmen keeping traditional skills alive. Avis found Industrial Way easily enough. It was just what it sounded like, a street lined with small warehouses and workshops on the unfashionable side of town, where rent was cheap and nobody cared what kind of noise you made. Unit C had a hand-painted sign hanging over the door. Darnell Woodworks, Custom Furniture and Repair. She stopped across the street, tying the donkeys to a fence post outside a closed auto body shop. The covering stayed on. She wasn't ready to answer questions about why she was here or what she was carrying. Through the workshop's large front windows, she could see James moving around inside, his silhouette backlit by the afternoon sun. 22 years had passed, but she'd have known him anywhere. Taller than average, broad-shouldered from years of physical work, moving with the deliberate care of someone who spent his days working with sharp tools and heavy materials. His hair was more grey than brown now, and he'd grown a beard. But the shape of him, the way he held himself, all of it was familiar in a way that made her chest ache. She'd loved him once, in her limited, broken way. He'd been patient with her moods, gentle when she withdrew, steady when everything else in her life felt like chaos. He'd deserved so much better than what she'd given him. Better than a wife who couldn't love him the way he needed. Better than being abandoned with a 6-month-old baby. Better than 22 years of silence and questions that would never be answered. The ring felt like it was burning a hole in her pocket, though she'd actually transferred it from Cedar's pack to her own jacket that morning, wanting it close when the moment came. If the moment came. She still wasn't sure she'd have the courage to face him directly. She watched through the window as he worked on what looked like a chair, running his hand over the wood to check for smoothness, making small adjustments with a plane. There was something meditative about his movements, something that spoke of hard-won peace. He'd made a life here, a good life from the looks of it. Who was she to disrupt that, even with something as small as a returned ring? An hour passed. Customers came and went, a woman picking up a repaired table, an older man dropping off a broken rocking chair, a young couple consulting with James about a custom piece. Avis watched it all from her spot across the street, hidden in plain sight, just another person standing near some donkeys. Nothing remarkable or worth noticing. The sun was starting to sink toward the horizon when James finally locked the shop door and flipped the sign to closed. Avis's heart began to pound. This was it. She either approached him now or waited until tomorrow, and she didn't think she could stand another sleepless night of anxiety and second-guessing. She crossed the street before she could talk herself out of it, her hand clutched around the ring in her pocket. James was walking toward a truck parked behind the building. She called out before she lost her nerve entirely. "James." He stopped, turned, looked at her with polite curiosity that turned to confusion and then, slowly, to recognition. She watched it happen, saw the exact moment when he realized who she was. His face went pale, then flushed, and for a long moment he just stared at her like she was a ghost he couldn't quite believe was real. Avis. Her name came out rough, barely more than a whisper. He took a step toward her, stopped, seemed uncertain whether he should come closer or run away. "Is that really you?" "It's me." Her voice was steadier than she'd expected, though her hands were shaking so badly she had to keep them in her pockets. "I know I'm probably the last person you expected to see. He shook his head, like he was trying to clear it. "I don't know what to say. Where have you been? Are you all right? Is Thomas—" "Thomas is fine," she interrupted. "I saw him, a few days ago, from a distance. He's married, has a life. I didn't talk to him." James's expression shifted to something that might have been disappointment or maybe relief. "He's been looking for you, you know, for years. He hired investigators, checked databases, everything. We all thought you were dead." "I might as well have been." The words came out flat, matter of fact. "I've been living up in the mountains, past Pine Ridge, alone mostly. Just me and some animals. 22 years. James said it like he was testing the weight of the time that had passed. 22 years, Avis. Do you have any idea what that was like? Coming home and finding you gone? Raising our son alone? Answering his questions about why his mother left?" "I know." She did know, had imagined it countless times, though imagination couldn't capture the true weight of what she'd done. "I didn't come here to make excuses. There aren't any good ones anyway." "Then why did you come?" She pulled the ring from her pocket, still on its chain, and held it out to him. The gold caught the late afternoon light, glinting softly. "To give this back. It was your grandmother's before it was mine. It should be back with your family." James stared at the ring like he'd never seen it before. Then, slowly, he reached out and took it, his fingers brushing hers for just a moment. The contact was electric, shocking, and they both pulled back quickly. "You kept it," he said, his voice strange. "All this time you kept it." I couldn't seem to let it go. It was the closest she could come to admitting she'd thought about him, about Thomas, about everything she'd left behind. But it needs to go back now. That's why I'm here." James looked from the ring to her face and back again, like he was trying to solve an equation that didn't quite add up. "That's it? You traveled all this way just to give me a ring?" "It's more than a ring." She was speaking carefully now, trying to find words for things she'd never been able to articulate. "It's an acknowledgement of what I did, of what you went through. It can't make up for any of it, but it's what I have to offer. I don't want your acknowledgement, Avis. I want to understand. Why did you leave? Was it something I did? Something I didn't do? Was it Thomas? Was it—" His voice cracked, and he had to stop and compose himself. "I've spent more than 20 years trying to figure out what I did wrong, and I never could. Maybe you can finally tell me." This was the conversation she'd dreaded, the one she'd hoped to avoid by leaving the ring anonymously. But standing here now, facing him, she realized she owed him at least an attempt at truth, even if the truth was inadequate. "You didn't do anything wrong," she said. "That's the thing, James. You were good to me, patient, kind, everything I should have wanted. But I was broken in ways I didn't understand then and barely understand now. I couldn't be a wife or a mother. I kept trying and failing, and every day I stayed felt like I was damaging you and Thomas more. So I ran. I thought—" She had to stop, swallow hard against the emotion rising in her throat. "I thought you'd both be better off without me. That wasn't your choice to make." There was anger in his voice now, finally, breaking through the shock. "You don't get to decide what's better for other people and then just disappear. That's not love, Avis. That's not even close to love. That's cowardice." "I know." She'd called it that herself, hadn't she? In the dark nights alone in her cabin, in the honest moments when she could admit what she'd really been. "You're right. It was cowardice. I'm not here to argue that. I'm just here to give back what wasn't mine, to keep and to tell you." She forced herself to meet his eyes. "To tell you I'm sorry. For all of it. For the pain I caused. For the questions I never answered. For the life I took from you when I left." James was quiet for a long time, turning the ring over in his hands. When he finally spoke, his voice was softer, tireder. "You know what the worst part was? It wasn't even the leaving, as awful as that was. It was the not knowing. Wondering if you were alive or dead, hurt or safe. If you'd chosen to go or if something terrible had happened. I filed missing person reports. I called hospitals. I imagined every possible scenario, each one worse than the last. And all that time, you were just up in the mountains, living your life." "I'm sorry," she said again, knowing it was insufficient but having nothing else to offer. "Yeah." He closed his fist around the ring. "Yeah, I bet you are. Question is, does being sorry change anything? Does it give me back those years? Does it give Thomas back his mother? No. There was no point in pretending otherwise. It doesn't change anything. But it's what I have." He looked at her for a long moment, and she saw so many emotions cross his face. She couldn't name them all, anger and grief and maybe something that might have been pity. Then he nodded once, sharp and final. "Okay. Thank you for returning the ring. I'll give it to Thomas if he wants it, or maybe save it for his children if he has any." He paused, then added, "He has a good life, you know. He turned out fine despite everything. Better than fine, actually. He's a good man. I'm glad." And she was, fiercely glad, even though the gladness was mixed with grief for all she'd missed. I won't tell him you were here unless you want me to. She shook her head. I left him something, a few days ago. A wooden horse I made when he was a baby. If he wants to find me after that, I guess he can. Otherwise, it's probably better if he doesn't know. James nodded again, looking tired now, like this conversation had drained something essential from him. I should go. It's a lot to process. Of course, I'm sorry for ambushing you like this. Avis. He said her name one more time, and there was something final about it, like a door closing. I hope you find whatever it is you're looking for up there in your mountains. I really do. But I also hope you understand that some things can't be fixed by showing up and saying sorry. Some damage is permanent. I understand? She did. She'd always understood that, even if she'd hoped otherwise. He walked to his truck, got in, and drove away without looking back. Avis stood in the empty parking lot and watched his taillights disappear around a corner. 2 down, 1 to go. And the last one would be the hardest, because unlike her son and her husband, the person she had to face next didn't even know she existed. The weather turned during the night. Avis woke to the sound of rain on her tarp and the smell of wet earth and pine. She'd camped in a roadside rest area 20 miles outside Coopersville, too tired to push any further after the emotional drain of facing James. The donkeys stood huddled together under a stand of trees, their backs dark with moisture, their heads lowered against the wind. She packed up in the rain, working quickly despite the cold water soaking through her jacket. Everything was harder when wet. The tarp wouldn't fold properly, the rope on the packs kept slipping, and her fingers fumbled with knots that would normally take seconds. But she'd lived through worse weather on her mountain, and she pushed through the discomfort with the practiced stoicism of someone who'd learned long ago that complaining changed nothing. The donkeys were less cooperative than usual when she tried to replace their burlap coverings. Cedar actively resisted, tossing his head and backing away, forcing Avis to gentle him with oats and soft words before he'd finally accept the hood. The rain made everything worse for them, too. They couldn't see where they were going, and now they were wet and cold on top of being blind. She couldn't blame them for their reluctance, but she needed them to stay covered a little longer. They were heading back toward Pine Ridge now, completing the circle. The last stop was the hardest one, the one that terrified her more than facing her son or her husband, because it involved not just admitting what she'd done, but revealing a secret that had shaped lives for almost 4 decades. Pine Ridge was 3 days away if she pushed hard. Maybe 4 if she took her time. The rain would slow them down, make the roads muddy and treacherous, but she couldn't afford to wait for better weather. The longer she delayed, the more likely she was to lose her nerve entirely and retreat back to her mountain without finishing what she'd started. They walked through morning rain that gradually softened to drizzle and then stopped entirely by midday, leaving everything dripping and grey. The landscape looked different in this weather, more subdued, the colours muted, the horizon close. Avis found herself thinking about her sister, trying to remember what Lorraine had looked like the last time she'd seen her. 12 years old, skinny and serious, with hair in braids and eyes that trusted too easily. Had that girl grown into a happy woman? Had she had a good life, despite the burden Avis had placed on her? The letter suggested she had. Lorraine had written about teaching school for 30 years, about being active in her church, about raising Stella with love and care, and doing her best to give her daughter, Avis's daughter, everything she needed. But between the lines, Avis could read the weight that secret had carried, the careful balancing act Lorraine had performed for decades, being mother to a child who wasn't biologically hers, while keeping that truth hidden from everyone who mattered. "I want you to know I never resented you for asking me to raise her," Lorraine had written. "She was a gift, even if the circumstances were hard. But I also want you to know that keeping this secret wore on me. There were so many times I wanted to tell her the truth, especially as she got older and started asking questions about her birth, about her father, about why she didn't look much like me. I told her what we agreed on, that her father was someone I'd known briefly, that he'd left before she was born, that I'd raised her alone because that's what needed doing. She accepted it because she trusted me. But Avis, she deserves to know the whole truth, and I can't tell her anymore. That responsibility falls to you now." The responsibility. As if Avis had any right to walk back into Stella's life after 38 years and upend everything she believed about herself. As if truth was always better than comfortable lies. But Lorraine had asked this of her, had made it clear in her letter that she considered it important, necessary, a final act of honesty after decades of necessary deception. The rain started again on the second day, harder this time, driven by wind that made the donkeys stumble and complain. Avis's clothes were soaked through, her boots squelching with every step, her pack heavy with absorbed water. She should have stopped, found shelter, waited out the storm. But she kept walking, driven by something she couldn't quite name. Not courage exactly, but its opposite. A fear that if she stopped moving, she'd never start again. By evening she was exhausted, shivering with cold, and the donkeys were in similar condition. She found an abandoned barn just off the road, its roof mostly intact, and led them inside gratefully. The space smelled of old hay and mouse droppings, but it was dry and out of the wind, and that was enough. She stripped the wet packs from the donkeys, removed their coverings, and rubbed them down with an old blanket she carried. Then she made herself do the same, changing into slightly less wet clothes from the bottom of her pack and wrapping herself in her sleeping bag even though it was barely evening. She didn't build a fire, too risky in a barn, even an abandoned one. Instead, she ate cold food and tried to stop shivering, listening to the rain hammer on the roof and the donkeys shift and sigh in the darkness. Somewhere in Pine Ridge, Stella was probably settling in for the evening, making dinner or grading papers or doing whatever it was that teachers did when they got home from work. Living her life, unaware that the woman who'd given birth to her was just 2 days away, carrying secrets and confessions and a burden of guilt that had grown heavier with every mile. Sleep came eventually, fitful and full of strange dreams. She was at her parents' house, which didn't exist anymore except in memory, and Lorraine was there, but she was 12 years old, and also somehow old, dying, urgent. "Tell her," Dream Lorraine kept saying. "Tell her the truth before it's too late." But when Avis tried to speak, no words would come out, and she woke, gasping, disoriented, her heart pounding. The third day brought better weather, cool and clear, with a wind that dried her clothes as she walked. The donkeys seemed to sense they were getting close to the end of the journey, or maybe they were just tired enough to be docile. They followed without complaint, their covered faces turned toward the road ahead, trusting her to guide them safely. By afternoon, familiar landmarks began appearing, the old sawmill, long since closed, the creek where she'd swum as a teenager, the turn-off to the cemetery where her parents were buried, where Lorraine now rested too. Each sight brought a mixture of nostalgia and dread, memory and regret. She skirted around Pine Ridge proper, taking back roads she remembered from her youth. She wasn't ready to walk through town again, to face more stares and questions. Besides, she knew where she was going. 447 Cedar Street, The house where she and Lorraine had grown up, the house that now belonged to Stella. It appeared through the trees late in the afternoon, exactly as she remembered it, but also changed. The paint was different, blue instead of white. The old oak tree in the front yard was gone, probably taken down after disease or storm damage. But the bones of the place were the same, the shape of it familiar in her muscles and bones. Avis stopped at the property line, her heart hammering. Stella was in there somewhere, the daughter she'd held for 3 days and then given away, the child she'd watched from a distance for 6 years before running away entirely. What did you say to someone like that? How did you explain a choice that had shaped both their lives, but that only one of them knew about? She reached into Pine's pack and pulled out the quilt Lorraine had made, unfolding it carefully. It was beautiful work, each patch representing a year of Stella's life, sewn with love and care and the weight of a secret. There was also the journal filled with poems and thoughts Avis had written over the years, addressed to a daughter who would never read them, and the birth certificate, official and undeniable, proof of a truth that had been hidden for nearly 4 decades. The locket was in her pocket, the one with the 2 photographs, baby Stella and teenage Avis. She'd carried it for so long it had worn smooth, the silver warm against her skin. This was everything she had to offer: proof, explanation, and artifacts of a love that had never died, even when she'd tried to kill it through distance and silence. But standing here now, looking at the house where her daughter lived, Avis realized she'd been fooling herself. She couldn't leave these things anonymously, couldn't drop them on a doorstep and run away like she had with Thomas. Stella deserved more than that. She deserved to hear the truth from the person who'd kept it from her, even if that truth came 38 years too late. Tomorrow. She'd come back tomorrow, when she'd had time to figure out what to say, how to explain the unexplainable. Tonight, she'd camp one more time, prepare herself one more time, and hope that when morning came, she'd find courage she didn't currently possess. She led the donkeys back into the woods, found a clearing with water and grass, and made her last camp before the final confrontation. She didn't sleep much. How could she, knowing what the next day would bring? Instead, she lay awake, rehearsing conversations in her head, trying to find words that would somehow make sense of what she'd done and why. None of them sounded right. All of them sounded like excuses. But she'd run out of time and distance, and tomorrow she'd have to face the truth she'd been running from for most of her adult life, that some mistakes can't be fixed, but they can at least be acknowledged. And maybe, just maybe, that would be enough. Morning came too soon, and not soon enough. Avis was awake before dawn, sitting by the remains of her fire and watching the sky lighten through the trees. The donkeys were still sleeping, or at least resting, their heads lowered and their breathing slow and steady. She envied them their peace, their ability to exist in the moment without the weight of past and future pressing down. She didn't eat breakfast, couldn't imagine keeping anything down with the anxiety churning in her stomach. Instead, she prepared the donkeys, replacing their coverings one last time, securing the packs that held the last of her offerings: the quilt, the journal, the birth certificate, the locket, everything that proved she was Stella's mother, that Lorraine had been her aunt, that the story Stella had been told her entire life was a careful, loving lie. By mid-morning, Avis was standing at the edge of Stella's property again, her courage wavering with every passing minute. The house looked peaceful in the morning light, smoke rising from the chimney, curtains open to let in the sun. A normal house on a normal day. She was about to shatter that normalcy forever. She was still trying to decide whether to approach when the front door opened and a man emerged. Not Stella, a man, maybe mid-40s, wearing work clothes and carrying a coffee mug. He walked to a truck parked in the driveway, set the mug on the hood, and began loading tools from the garage. A husband, a boyfriend, a handyman. Avis had no idea, hadn't considered that Stella might not live alone. The man worked for 20 minutes, occasionally going back into the house and emerging with more items. Then Stella herself appeared in the doorway, and Avis's breath caught in her throat. She was beautiful. Not in a conventional way, perhaps, but in a way that reminded Avis painfully of herself at that age. Tall and sturdy, with dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, wearing jeans and a sweater that had seen better days. But it was her face that made Avis's eyes sting with tears. Her face, which was so clearly Avis's own face at 38, the same strong jaw and high cheekbones, the same way of holding her head tilted slightly to one side when she was thinking. Stella said something to the man, laughing at whatever response he gave. He kissed her cheek. Yes, a husband then, and got in his truck, backing out of the driveway with a wave. Stella watched him go, then turned back towards the house. She was about to go inside when she paused, her attention caught by something across the road. Avis realized with horror that Stella was looking directly at her. Or not at her exactly, but at the donkeys, 3 animals with covered faces standing at the property line, with an old woman holding their leads. It must have looked strange, unsettling even. Stella's expression shifted from curiosity to concern. She started across the yard toward Avis, moving with purpose, but not alarm. "Excuse me? Are you all right? Do you need help?" Avis's throat closed up. She couldn't speak, couldn't move. This was her daughter, walking toward her, and she had no idea what to say or how to say it. Stella came closer, her concern deepening as she got a better look at Avis, probably seeing the weathered face, the rough clothes, the signs of someone who'd been traveling hard. "Mom? Are you lost? Do you need me to call someone?" "No." Avis forced the word out. "No, I'm not lost. I came here to see you. To talk to you." "To talk to me?" Stella looked confused now, glancing at the donkeys and then back at Avis. "Do I know you?" "No. Yes, it's complicated." Avis was handling this badly, could feel it slipping away from her, but she couldn't seem to find the right words. "Your aunt, your mother, Lorraine. She recently passed away." Stella's expression shifted to sadness, confirmation of something Avis already knew. "Yes. 3 months ago. Did you know her?" "I did. I knew her very well. She was my sister." The words hung in the air between them. Stella stared at Avis, processing this information, her eyes widening slightly. "Your sister? But that would make you—" She stopped, confusion clouding her face. "I don't understand." Mom never mentioned having a sister. She said all her family was gone. She probably told you that because it was mostly true. Our parents died years ago, and Avis had to stop, swallow hard. "I left a long time ago. I haven't been part of this family for more than 20 years. "Okay." Stella was speaking carefully now, like she was trying to navigate uncertain ground. "I'm sorry for your loss. For our loss. But I still don't understand why you're here, why you came to see me specifically." This was it. The moment when everything changed. Avis reached into her jacket and pulled out the sealed envelope Lorraine had sent, the one marked, to be opened by Avis alone. She'd read it so many times she had it memorized, but now she handed it to Stella along with the birth certificate. "Your mother? Lorraine?" She left me some things when she died. These are for you. But before you read them, I need to tell you something that's going to be hard to hear." Stella took the documents, but didn't open them, her eyes fixed on Avis's face. "What is it? What's going on?" "Lorraine wasn't your mother." The words came out flat, brutal in their simplicity. "I am. I'm your birth mother. Lorraine was your aunt. She raised you because I asked her to, because I was 17 and scared and didn't know how to be anyone's mother. We told everyone she was yours, created paperwork that made it legal, and I walked away. I've stayed away for 38 years. But now she's gone, and she asked me, in her last letter, to tell you the truth." Stella's face went pale. She looked down at the birth certificate in her hand, read it once, twice, her lips moving soundlessly. When she looked back up at Avis, her expression was a mixture of shock and something that might have been anger. "This is some kind of joke, some scam. My mother died, and now you're showing up claiming to be, what? Trying to get money? Inheritance?" "No." Avis shook her head. "I don't want anything from you. I just wanted you to know the truth. Lorraine thought it was important. That's why she left you these documents, why she wrote this letter explaining everything. I don't believe you." Stella's voice was rising now, defensive. "My mother would have told me. She wouldn't have kept something like this from me my entire life. She kept it because I asked her to, because we both thought." Avis stopped, realizing how inadequate her explanations were. "Read the letter, please. It's in her handwriting. She explains everything better than I can." Stella looked at the envelope like it might bite her, then slowly opened it and pulled out the pages inside. Avis watched as she read, saw the emotions play across her face. Disbelief giving way to confusion, confusion to shock, shock to something that might have been grief or might have been rage. When she finished, her hands were shaking. She knew. Stella's voice was barely above a whisper. She knew she was dying. That's why she wrote this. She wanted me to know before. She couldn't finish the sentence, just stood there, holding the letter and looking lost in a way that made Avis's chest ache. "I'm so sorry," Avis said, knowing the words were insufficient. "I know this doesn't change anything. I know I have to write to your forgiveness or even your acknowledgement. But Lorraine wanted you to know, and I owed it to her to tell you." Stella looked up, and there were tears on her face now, though whether from grief or anger Avis couldn't tell. "Why? Why did you give me away? Was I that much of a mistake? That much of a burden?" "No." The word came out fierce, almost violent. "You were never a mistake, never a burden. But I was 17 years old and so scared I couldn't think straight. I had no support, no money, no idea how to take care of a baby. Lorraine offered to help and I thought," Avis's voice broke, "I thought you'd be better off with her, that she could give you the life I couldn't, that you deserved someone who knew how to be a mother. And then you just left? Left me and never looked back." "I looked back every day," Avis said quietly. "Every single day for 6 years. I watched you grow up from a distance. I saw Lorraine with you, saw how much she loved you, how good she was at being your mother. And it hurt so much to watch that I eventually had to leave entirely. I had another child by then, a son, and I was failing him too. So I ran. I ran away, and I hid in the mountains, and I told myself it was better for everyone if I just disappeared." "That's a coward's choice." Stella's voice was hard now, angry. "You don't get to make decisions about what's better for other people, and then just abandon them. That's not sacrifice. That's selfishness. You're right. Avis didn't try to defend herself. It was selfish. All of it. The leaving, the staying away, the silence. I was a coward. But I'm here now, trying to at least give you the truth, even if it's 38 years too late. Stella looked at her for a long moment, and Avis could see her daughter, because she was her daughter, undeniably, the proof written in the shape of her face and the set of her shoulders, trying to process everything she'd just learned, everything she'd believed about herself, about her mother, about her origins, had just been upended, and Avis had done that to her, had walked back into her life after decades of absence and dropped this truth like a bomb. I need you to leave, Stella said finally. I need time to process this, to think. I can't do this right now. I understand. Avis reached into Pine's pack and pulled out the quilt, the journal, the locket. She held them out to Stella. These are yours. Your aunt, your mother. She made the quilt. Each patch represents a year of your life. The journal is things I wrote over the years, addressed to you but never sent. And the locket has pictures of both of us from when you were born. You don't have to keep any of it. You don't owe me anything. But they're yours if you want them. Stella took the items mechanically, like she wasn't quite sure what she was doing. Then she looked at Avis one more time, her eyes full of pain and confusion, and something that might have been recognition. Did you ever love me? The question was small, vulnerable, the kind of thing a child might ask. Yes. Avis's voice broke on the word. More than I knew how to handle. That was part of the problem. I loved you so much it terrified me, and I didn't know how to live with that terror. So I did the only thing I knew how to do. I ran. Stella nodded slowly, then turned and walked back toward the house, carrying the quilt and journal and locket like they were both precious and poisonous. She didn't look back. Avis stood there for a long time after the door closed, staring at the house, feeling emptied out and exhausted and strangely relieved. She'd done it. She'd told the truth. It hadn't brought forgiveness or reconciliation, but it had brought honesty, and maybe that was all she'd ever be able to offer. The donkeys were restless, tired of standing still, ready to move. Avis gathered their leads and started walking back toward the woods, toward her camp, toward the mountain that had been her home for so long. 3 stops, 3 truths told. The journey was complete. Now she just had to figure out how to live with what came next. Avis didn't go back to her mountain immediately. Instead, she camped in the woods outside Pine Ridge for 3 days, unable to bring herself to leave, unable to stop hoping that maybe Stella would come looking for her. She knew it was irrational, knew that what she'd revealed needed time to sink in, that Stella probably never wanted to see her again. But hope was a stubborn thing, apparently, even after 22 years of practice at killing it. On the 2nd day, she removed the burlap coverings from the donkeys permanently. There was no need for them anymore, no more destinations, no more burdens to carry. The animals seemed relieved, shaking their heads and blinking in the sunlight, reacquainting themselves with a world they could see. Avis watched them graze and thought about what those coverings had represented. Her own blindness, her own refusal to see clearly what she was doing and what it cost. She spent those 3 days thinking about Lorraine's letter, the parts she hadn't shared with Stella because they were meant for her alone. Her sister had written about forgiveness, about understanding, about how carrying guilt forever was another form of cowardice. "You've punished yourself long enough," Lorraine had written. "At some point, You have to decide whether you're going to keep living in your exile, or whether you're going to step back into the world and accept that you're human, that you made mistakes, and that maybe you deserve another chance at being part of something bigger than your own guilt. Easy for Lorraine to say. She'd been the good one, the one who stayed, who raised a child that wasn't hers and did it with grace and love and an apparently endless capacity for sacrifice. What right did Avis have to forgiveness when she'd done nothing to earn it? But on the third day, something happened that changed everything. She was fetching water from the creek when she heard footsteps behind her. She turned, expecting a hiker or maybe a ranger telling her she couldn't camp here, and instead found Stella standing at the edge of the clearing. Her daughter looked exhausted, like she hadn't slept much in the past 3 days. Her eyes were red-rimmed, her hair uncombed, her clothes the same ones she'd been wearing when they first met. She was clutching the journal Avis had given her, holding it against her chest like a shield. "I read it," Stella said without preamble. "All of it. Everything you wrote over the years." Avis set down her water jug carefully, her heart suddenly pounding. "You didn't have to. I know it doesn't change anything." "It changes everything." Stella took a step closer. "Do you know what it's like? Finding out your entire life has been built on a lie. That the person you called Mom wasn't actually your mother. That the woman who gave birth to you was living in the mountains the whole time, close enough to visit but choosing not to." "I'm sorry, I'm not finished." Stella's voice was sharp, controlled anger barely leashed. "I spent 3 days being furious. At you, at Mom, at everyone who knew and didn't tell me. I wanted to burn everything you gave me, pretend you'd never shown up, go back to believing the comfortable story I'd been told. But I couldn't, because you know what's in this journal. You know what you wrote?" Avis shook her head. She'd written those entries over years, pouring out thoughts and feelings she had no other outlet for, never imagining anyone would read them. "You wrote about me," Stella continued, "about watching me from a distance, about my first day of school, about when I fell off my bike and scraped my knee, about my graduation. You were there. You were there for all of it, watching from the edges like a ghost. And you know what the worst part is? My mum, Lorraine, she knew. She knew you were there. She wrote about it in her diary. I found it yesterday, going through her things looking for more answers. She wrote that she knew you'd come down from the mountain sometimes, that she'd catch glimpses of you at the edge of town, always leaving before anyone could approach, and she never told me. Never said, 'Your birth mother is here. She wants to see you but doesn't know how.'" Avis felt something crack inside her chest. She was protecting you, protecting both of us probably. What good would it have done to tell you? "I could have known." Stella's voice rose, the anger breaking through. "I could have known that someone else out there carried me, gave birth to me, thought about me. Do you have any idea how many times I felt like I didn't quite fit? Like there was something missing? I spent my whole childhood wondering why I didn't look like my mom, why I was so much taller, why I had interests and talents she didn't understand. And all along, there was an explanation. But everyone decided I was better off not knowing. We thought." Avis stopped, recognizing the futility of defending choices made decades ago. "You're right. We made decisions that weren't ours to make. Both of us. Lorraine and me. We shaped your life without your consent. And that was wrong. I'm sorry." Stella was quiet for a moment, visibly trying to control her emotions. When she spoke again, her voice was steadier. "The journal. The things you wrote. They weren't the words of someone who didn't care. They were the words of someone who loved me, but didn't know how to show it. Someone who was watching from a distance, because being any closer would hurt too much. Yes, it was all Avis could say, that simple acknowledgement. I need to understand something. Stella moved closer, close enough that Avis could see the exact shade of her eyes, brown with flecks of green, just like Avis's own. Why now? Why, after 38 years, did you decide to come back and tell me the truth? Why not just let it stay buried with Mom? Because she asked me to. Avis gestured to the journal. Her letter? Did you read all of it? The part where she asked me to tell you? I read it, but that's what she wanted. What did you want? It was a good question, one Avis had been asking herself for 3 days. What did she want? Forgiveness? Redemption? A relationship with this daughter she'd never really known? I wanted to stop running, she said finally. I've been running my whole adult life, from responsibility, from pain, from people who needed me. Your aunt's death made me realize I'd run out of time to make things right, or at least to make them honest. So I came back. I delivered what I needed to deliver, told the truths I needed to tell. I didn't expect anything from you. I still don't. Good. Stella's voice was hard again, because I don't have anything to give you. Not yet, anyway. Maybe not ever. You're a stranger to me, a stranger who happens to share my DNA. I don't know how to think of you as my mother, when my mother, the woman who raised me, who was there for every important moment of my life, just died 3 months ago. I'm still grieving her. I can't make room for you, too. I understand. And she did. She understood perfectly the impossibility of what she was asking, the unfairness of appearing at the worst possible time and demanding emotional energy that Stella didn't have to spare. But, Stella continued, and that single word made Avis's breath catch. I'm not saying never. I'm saying not now. I need time. Months, probably, maybe years. But the journal, reading your words, seeing how you thought about me, understanding that you were there even when I couldn't see you, it made me think that maybe, someday, we could talk. Really talk. Not like this. Not in a crisis, but like 2 people getting to know each other. If you're willing to wait. I've waited 38 years, Avis said quietly. I can wait longer. Stella nodded, then held out the journal. I'm keeping this, and the quilt, and the locket. They're mine, you're right about that. But I want you to know I treasure them. Not because of you, not yet, but because they represent something I didn't know I was missing. A piece of my history. A connection to someone who thought about me, even when they couldn't be with me. Thank you. Avis didn't reach for the journal. That's more than I deserve. Maybe. Stella tucked the journal back under her arm. But Mum's letter said something that's been stuck in my head. She said that everyone deserves a chance to be more than their worst mistake. That you spent your whole life punishing yourself for leaving, and that maybe it was time for someone to tell you that the punishment has been enough. Avis felt tears prick her eyes. That sounds like her. It was her last gift to both of us, I think. Permission to be human. Permission to make mistakes and still be worthy of love. Stella paused, then added, I'm not ready to love you. I'm barely ready to know you. But I'm willing to consider the possibility that someday I might be. If you're still here, if you don't run away again. I won't run, Avis said, and she meant it. Something had shifted inside her during this journey, some fundamental change that made the idea of retreating back to her mountain exile feel impossible. She'd stepped back into the world, painful as it was, and now she couldn't imagine leaving it again. I'll be at my cabin. Same place I've been for 22 years. When you're ready, if you're ever ready, you know where to find me. Stella nodded once, then turned and started walking back toward town, but after a few steps, she stopped and looked back. What should I call you? If we do talk someday? Avis considered the question. Not Mum. That belongs to Lorraine. She earned it. Maybe just Avis, or whatever feels right to you. Avis, Stella repeated, testing it out. Then she nodded again and continued walking, disappearing through the trees, leaving Avis standing alone in the clearing with her donkeys and the weight of a future that suddenly contained more than just survival. That night, Avis packed up her camp and prepared to return to her mountain. But it felt different now. Not like retreat, not like exile. More like going home to a place where she could wait, where she could continue her life while leaving the door open for the possibility that someday someone might knock. She thought about James, about the way he'd closed the door on their past with finality that was probably healthy and necessary. She thought about Thomas, about the wooden horse left on his doorstep, about whether he'd understood what it meant or if it had just confused him. And she thought about Stella, about the journal full of words she'd written in loneliness and isolation, never imagining they'd bridge a gap she'd thought unbridgeable. The journey hadn't given her what she'd expected. It hadn't brought forgiveness or redemption or closure, but it had brought honesty and truth and the possibility, fragile and uncertain, that the future might hold something more than just endless winter and isolation. As she led the donkeys back toward the trail that would take her home, Avis felt something she hadn't felt in years. Hope. Small, cautious, easy to crush. But real. And maybe that was enough. 3 months passed before Stella knocked on the door of Avis's cabin. It was January now, deep winter, with snow piled halfway up the windows and the world reduced to shades of white and grey. Avis had settled back into her mountain routine, wood splitting, water hauling, tending the animals, but the routine felt different now, less like hiding, more like simply living. She'd made some changes to the cabin during those months, nothing dramatic, but significant. She'd repaired the porch, which had been sagging for years. She'd cleaned out the second room, which she'd been using for storage, and set up a simple bed and dresser. Just in case, she told herself. Just in case someone decided to visit. Just in case. When the knock came, she almost didn't believe it at first. But there it was again, 3 deliberate raps on the door. She set down the bread dough she'd been kneading and wiped her hands on her apron, trying to calm her suddenly racing heart. It could be anyone. A ranger, a lost hiker, someone from town with a message. It didn't have to be. She opened the glass door, and there was Stella. Her daughter was dressed for winter, wearing a heavy coat and boots, a scarf wrapped around her neck. Her cheeks were flushed from the cold and the climb, and her breath made clouds in the frigid air. She looked uncertain, almost shy, her hands shoved deep in her pockets. "Hi," Stella said. "I hope it's okay that I came. I know I should have called or something, but I didn't have your number, and I wasn't sure." She stopped, seeming to realize she was rambling. "Can I come in?" "Of course." Avis stepped back quickly, gesturing Stella inside. "Please, it's freezing out there." Stella entered cautiously, looking around the cabin with obvious curiosity. It was a single room, mostly, with the kitchen area in one corner, a wood stove in the center, and Avis's bed against one wall. Simple, rough, but clean and well-maintained, The kind of place someone lived rather than just survived in. "This is where you've been all this time?" Stella asked. "This is it. Not much, but it's home." Avis moved to the stove, adding wood automatically. "Can I make you tea? Coffee? I have soup on the stove if you're hungry from the hike up." "Tea would be nice, thank you." Stella unwrapped her scarf, unbuttoned her coat. Underneath she was wearing jeans and a thick sweater, and around her neck, Avis noticed with a jolt, was the silver locket. Avis busied herself with the tea, filling the kettle, pulling out 2 mismatched mugs, trying to give Stella time to settle, to gather whatever thoughts had brought her up this mountain. Her hands shook slightly as she worked, but she managed to keep her voice steady when she spoke. "How was the hike up?" "Cold. Beautiful. The trail markers were hard to see under the snow, but I managed." Stella had taken a seat at the small table, her hands folded in front of her. "I asked in town how to find you. The woman at the general store gave me directions. She seemed surprised that I wanted to come up here. People don't usually visit." Avis set the mugs on the table, along with honey and a small pitcher of cream. "I prefer it that way, usually." "Usually." Stella picked up on the qualifier. "But not today. Not today." Avis sat across from her, wrapping her hands around her own mug for warmth and something to do. "I'm glad you came. I wasn't sure you would." "I wasn't sure either." Stella added honey to her tea, stirring it slowly. "I've been thinking about it for weeks, writing letters I didn't send, picking up the phone and putting it down. My husband said I should just come, stop torturing myself with indecision. So here I am." "Your husband," Avis latched on to this detail. "The man I saw that day. Is he good to you?" A small smile crossed Stella's face. "Yes." "Marcus. We've been married for 8 years. He's a contractor, builds houses. He's patient with me, which is probably his best quality. I'm not always easy to be with." "I can't imagine that's true." "You don't know me." Stella said it without malice, just stating a fact. "That's part of why I'm here. I thought maybe we should start fixing that." "If you want to." Avis's throat tightened. "I want to. More than I know how to say." They sat in silence for a moment, sipping tea, each waiting for the other to begin. Finally, Stella pulled something from her coat pocket, a small notebook, spiral-bound, its pages dog-eared and marked with tabs. "I have questions," she said. "Lots of them. I've been writing them down, trying to organize them, figure out where to start. Is that okay? Can I ask you things?" "Anything." Avis meant it, absolutely. "I'll answer everything as honestly as I can." Stella opened the notebook, flipped through a few pages, then looked up at Avis. "Okay. First question. The hardest one. When you held me after I was born, those 3 days you had me before you gave me to Lorraine. Did you love me?" Avis had known this question would come, had prepared herself for it, but hearing it out loud still hit like a physical blow. "Yes. Absolutely yes. I loved you so much it terrified me. You were this perfect tiny thing, and I was 17 and so scared I couldn't breathe. I kept thinking I was going to break you somehow, that I'd do something wrong, and you'd be damaged forever because I didn't know what I was doing. But you gave me away. I gave you to someone who could love you better, who could give you stability, safety, all the things I couldn't provide." Avis paused, searching for words. I know it sounds like an excuse. Maybe it was. But at the time, it felt like the only option. Keep you and watch us both struggle, or give you to Lorraine and trust that she'd give you the life you deserved. Stella made a note in her book, though Avis couldn't see what she wrote. Second question. You watched me growing up. Mum's diary mentioned it, and you wrote about it in your journal. Why? If you'd made the choice to give me away, why torture yourself by watching from a distance? Because I couldn't not watch. It was the simplest answer Avis could give. Because even though I'd given you to Lorraine, you were still mine, still part of me. And I needed to know you were okay, that I'd made the right choice. Every time I saw you smiling, saw you healthy and happy with Lorraine, it confirmed that I'd done the right thing, even though it hurt to watch. Did it ever occur to you that I might want to know you were there? That maybe I would have liked having 2 people who loved me instead of just one? Of course it occurred to me. Avis's voice was thick now. But by the time you were old enough to understand, I'd already left. I'd already run away from everything, including you. How could I show up then and explain? Hi, I'm your birth mother, the one who gave you away and then abandoned you a second time by leaving town entirely. What good would that have done? Stella was quiet for a long moment, her tea forgotten. When she spoke again, her voice was softer. Mum loved you, you know, even after everything, even after you left. She told me once, this was years ago, before I knew the truth. She told me that she had a sister who got lost somewhere along the way. She said she prayed for that sister every night, hoped she'd found peace wherever she was. I didn't think much of it at the time. Now I realize she was talking about you. Tears spilled down Avis's cheeks before she could stop them. She wiped them away roughly. She was better than I ever deserved, better than I ever was. Maybe. Stella didn't disagree. But she also made choices that hurt people. She kept secrets that maybe shouldn't have been kept. She was human, just like you, just like all of us. They talked for 2 hours, working through Stella's notebook of questions. Where had Avis gone after leaving Pine Ridge? Why had she chosen the mountains? Had she ever thought about coming back? Did she have other children besides Thomas and Stella? Did she regret her choices? Avis answered everything as honestly as she could, not trying to paint herself in a better light, not making excuses. Just telling the truth as she understood it, even when the truth made her look like the coward she knew she'd been. Eventually the conversation wound down, exhausted itself. Stella closed her notebook and tucked it away, finishing the last of her now cold tea. She looked tired, but also somehow lighter, like the weight of unanswered questions had been partially lifted. I should go, she said. It's getting late and I don't want to hike down in the dark. Stay. The word came out before Avis could stop it. Please, I have a spare room. It's not much, but it's warm. You can leave first thing in the morning when it's light. Stella hesitated, clearly torn between caution and curiosity. I don't know if I'm ready for that. It's just a room, a bed and a dresser. Nothing more. But I'd feel better, knowing you weren't trying to navigate that trail after dark. After a long moment, Stella nodded. Okay, thank you. They ate dinner together. The soup Avis had mentioned earlier, thick with vegetables from her summer garden, served with bread she'd baked that morning. It was a simple meal, but Stella ate with obvious appreciation, asking about the garden, about how Avis preserved food for winter, about the practical details of mountain living. The conversation was easier now, less fraught than the afternoon's interrogation had been. They talked about ordinary things, weather, animals, the challenges of living in isolation. Stella told stories about teaching, about her students and their families, about the small dramas of small-town school life. Avis found herself laughing at a story about a 6th grader who'd brought a baby goat to class for show and tell, only to have it escape and cause chaos in the hallway. I had to chase it down, Stella said, grinning at the memory. Me and the janitor, running through the school with a goat, bleating and kids cheering us on. The principal was furious, but I couldn't stop laughing. It was ridiculous. You're good with children, Avis observed. I can tell from the way you talk about them. I love teaching. Always have. Stella's smile faded slightly. Mum, Lorraine, she was a teacher too. Elementary school. She's the reason I went into education. I wanted to be like her. She must have been proud of you. She was. Stella's voice caught slightly. She came to my graduation when I got my teaching degree, cried through the whole ceremony, told everyone who would listen that her daughter was going to change lives. She paused, then added quietly, I miss her. Every day. I'm sorry I took her from you too soon. If I'd told you the truth earlier. Don't. Stella shook her head firmly. We're not doing that. Not tonight. Tonight we're just two people having dinner. Tomorrow we can go back to guilt and regret if we need to. But tonight, let's just be. So they did. They cleaned up the dishes together, Stella washing while Avis dried, falling into an easy rhythm that felt surprisingly natural. Then Avis showed Stella the spare room she'd prepared, watching nervously as her daughter took in the simple bed, the clean sheets, the small nightstand with a lamp. It's perfect, Stella said. Thank you. There are extra blankets in the chest if you get cold, and if you need anything during the night, I'll be fine. Stella turned to face her. Avis, thank you for today, for answering my questions, for not making excuses or trying to manipulate me into forgiving you before I'm ready. I don't expect forgiveness. Avis said it clearly, wanting there to be no misunderstanding. I just wanted you to know the truth. Whatever you decide to do with that truth is up to you. Stella nodded, then did something unexpected. She stepped forward and hugged Avis, brief and awkward, but genuine. Good night, she said, then disappeared into the spare room, closing the door softly behind her. Avis stood in the hallway for a long moment, her hand pressed against her chest, where she could still feel the ghost of that embrace. Then she went to her own bed, lay down fully clothed, and stared at the ceiling, listening to the small sounds of someone else in her house. Water running, floorboards creaking, the rustle of sheets being arranged for sleep. She didn't sleep much. How could she, knowing her daughter was just a room away, knowing that tomorrow Stella would leave, and she had no idea when, or if, she'd come back. But it was a different kind of sleeplessness than she'd experienced for the past 22 years. Not the restless anxiety of guilt, but something closer to anticipation. Like standing at the edge of something new and not quite knowing if it would be wonderful or terrible, but knowing it would be real. Morning came with pale winter light filtering through the frosted windows. Avis was up before Stella, starting the fire, putting coffee on, making breakfast, eggs from her chickens, more bread, jam she'd made from wild berries. Normal things, domestic things, the kind of things mothers did for their children every day without thinking about it. When Stella emerged, she looked rested, more at peace than she had the day before. She accepted the coffee gratefully, warming her hands on the mug. I've been thinking, she said, without preamble, about what happens next. With us. Avis's heart clenched. Okay. I'm not ready for a big relationship. I'm not ready to call you Mom or have you at family dinners or any of that. But I'd like to keep talking. Maybe I could come back up here in a few weeks. We could talk more. Get to know each other gradually. I'd like that. Avis had to work to keep her voice steady, Very much. And maybe— Stella hesitated, then pushed forward. Maybe eventually you could come down to town, meet Marcus properly, see where I live. If you're comfortable with that. I'm comfortable with whatever you need. Avis meant it absolutely. This is your choice, Stella, your timeline. I'll follow your lead. They ate breakfast together, talking about logistics, when Stella might visit next, how they could communicate in between. Avis would need to get a phone, something she'd resisted for years. The conversation was practical, grounded, exactly what Avis needed to believe this was real, and not just a beautiful dream she'd wake from. When it was time for Stella to leave, they stood on the porch together, looking out at the snow-covered landscape. The sun was higher now, making everything sparkle. "The quilt," Stella said suddenly. "The one Lorraine made. I brought it with me last night. It's in my bag. I wanted you to see it, to know I treasure it." She went back inside, returned with a large canvas bag, and pulled out the quilt. Avis had seen it before, briefly, when she'd first given it to Stella. But looking at it now, in the clear winter light, she could really see the work that had gone into it. Each patch was different. Fabrics from clothes Stella had worn, from curtains in their house, from scraps Lorraine had saved over the years. Each one carefully stitched, carefully labeled with a year. "She started this when I was born," Stella explained, spreading it out so Avis could see the full design. "She added a patch every year on my birthday. Look, here's one from my baby blanket. This one is from my first day of school dress. This one is from curtains in my bedroom when I was 10. She documented my whole life in fabric and thread." Avis traced one of the patches with her finger, feeling the weight of her sister's love stitched into every seam. "She loved you so much." "I know, and that's what I keep coming back to. She had every right to resent me, to resent you for putting this burden on her. But she didn't. She chose love instead. And if she could do that, if she could love someone else's child as completely as she loved me, then maybe I can find a way to let you into my life too. Not as a replacement for her. Never that. But as someone who's also part of my story. That's all I could ever ask for." Stella folded the quilt carefully and tucked it back in her bag. Then she pulled on her coat, wrapped her scarf around her neck, and picked up her backpack. At the door, she paused and turned back. "One more thing. In your journal, you wrote about Thomas, about leaving him the wooden horse. Do you know if he understood what it meant?" Avis shook her head. "I don't know. I left before I could see his reaction. Maybe he threw it away. Maybe he kept it. I'll probably never find out." "Maybe you will." Stella smiled slightly. "Maybe he'll surprise you, the way I surprised you by showing up here. Maybe none of this is as final as you think it is." Then she was gone, hiking down the trail with sure steps, not looking back. Avis watched until she disappeared into the trees, then went back inside her cabin. It felt emptier now, but not in a bad way. More like a space that had been filled and would be filled again, rather than a space that had always been empty. She spent the afternoon doing her normal chores, but her mind was elsewhere, replaying the conversations, the small moments of connection, the hug that had surprised them both, and thinking about what Stella had said about Thomas. Maybe none of this is as final as you think. Maybe. Just maybe. Spring came to the mountain differently than it came to the valleys below, slower, more tentative, with snow lingering in the shadows long after the meadows had turned green. But it came, as it always did, bringing with it the sound of water running everywhere, of birds returning, of the world waking up from its long winter sleep. Avis stood on her porch on a morning in late April, watching the sunrise paint the peaks gold and pink. Stella had visited 3 more times since that first overnight stay in January. Each visit had been a little longer, a little easier, the conversations flowing more naturally as they learned each other's rhythms and quirks. Marcus had come with her on the last visit, a quiet man with kind eyes who'd looked around the cabin and immediately started suggesting improvements. Not criticisms, just practical ideas from someone who built things for a living. "You could extend this porch," he'd said. "Give you more covered space for sitting outside. And those windows, I could replace them with better insulation. Keep more heat in during winter." Avis had accepted the suggestions, grateful for the implied promise in them, that she'd still be here next winter, that people would still be visiting, that her isolation was no longer so complete or so necessary. The phone Marcus had helped her install sat on the small table by the door. It rang rarely, usually Stella calling to check in or arrange the next visit. But knowing it was there, knowing she was connected to the world, beyond her mountain, made a difference she hadn't expected. This morning, though, she wasn't thinking about Stella or the phone or the improvements Marcus wanted to make. She was thinking about the letter that had arrived yesterday, carried up by a hiker who'd been paid to deliver it. The return address was from Ridgeway, from Thomas. She'd stared at that envelope for an entire evening before finding the courage to open it. What could he possibly have to say to her? Was he angry? Confused? Had he even understood what the wooden horse meant? Or had he simply been bewildered by a strange gift from a stranger? The letter was short, written in neat, careful handwriting that reminded her painfully of his father's. "Dear Avis," it began. Not "Dear Mom," which was both a relief and a knife to the heart. "I received the wooden horse you left. Lily told me about the woman who brought it, and I knew immediately who you must be. I've kept the horse all these years, stored away with my other baby things. I remember it, vaguely, from very early childhood. Seeing it again brought back feelings I didn't know I still had. I won't pretend I understand why you left, or why you stayed away. Dad tried to explain it to me when I was growing up, but his explanations never quite made sense. I spent a lot of my childhood angry at you, then a lot of my teenage years trying not to care, and most of my adult life convincing myself I was fine without you. But here's the thing, I'm going to be a father myself soon. Lily is pregnant. We're having a boy, and knowing that has made me think a lot about what it means to be a parent, about the choices people make, and why they make them. I don't think I'm ready to have a relationship with you. I don't know if I ever will be. But I wanted you to know that I'm not angry anymore. I'm just sad about what we both lost, and grateful for what I had with Dad, who was always enough even when I told myself he wasn't. Maybe someday we'll talk. Maybe not. But I wanted you to know that I got your gift, and I understood it, and I'm keeping it for my son, so he can know that his grandmother, whoever she was, thought about him before he was even born. That has to count for something. Thomas, Avis had cried when she read it, great sobbing tears that came from somewhere so deep she hadn't known it existed. Not tears of joy exactly, but tears of release. He wasn't offering forgiveness or reconciliation, but he was offering acknowledgement. He was saying, I see you, I understand that you existed and tried in your way, and that's enough for now. It was more than she'd hoped for, more than she deserved. She'd written back immediately, a short note that tried to match his tone, honest, careful, not asking for more than he was willing to give. She'd told him about Stella, about the journey she'd made with the 3 donkeys, about the truth she'd finally stopped running from. She'd congratulated him on his impending fatherhood and told him that whatever he decided about their relationship, she wished him only happiness and peace. And then she'd given the letter to the same hiker who'd delivered Thomas's, paid him to take it back down to town and mail it, and tried not to hope too hard that Thomas would write again. Now, standing on her porch in the spring morning, Avis thought about the journey that had started 6 months ago with 3 donkeys and 3 burdens. She thought about how she'd covered their faces, thinking she was protecting them from fear, when really she'd been the one too afraid to see where she was going. The donkeys grazed in the meadow below the cabin, their coats shaggy with winter fur that would soon shed away. They'd earned their retirement from burden carrying. These days they were just companions, just animals living their lives in her orbit, asking nothing more than food and shelter and occasional attention. Inside the cabin, the spare room that had once been storage was now truly a guest room. Stella's things occupied the dresser, a change of clothes, some books, the quilt folded at the foot of the bed. Not a permanent presence, but not temporary either. Something in between, something that acknowledged connection without demanding permanence. On the kitchen table sat a gift Marcus had brought on his last visit, a wooden walking stick he'd carved himself, the handle worn smooth and comfortable in the hand. For the woman who walked back into the world, he'd said when he gave it to her, in case you need to walk further. Avis picked up that walking stick now, running her hand over its familiar surface. She'd been using it for her daily walks, finding that it helped with balance on uneven terrain, that having something to lean on made the journey easier, even when the path was clear. She thought she might take a walk today, down toward Pine Ridge, maybe stop at the general store for supplies. Maybe, and this was a new thought, still fragile, stop at the diner for lunch. Pauline would be there. Pauline, who'd been Lorraine's best friend. There would be questions, probably about why Avis had come back to town, about the strange journey with the blindfolded donkeys that people still talked about. But maybe it was time to stop hiding from those questions. Maybe it was time to have some answers. The sun cleared the ridge, flooding the meadow with light. The donkeys raised their heads, blinking, then went back to grazing. Somewhere in the distance, a hawk cried out, its call echoing off the mountains. And in Avis Darnell's chest, something that had been closed for a very long time opened just a little wider, letting in light and air and the possibility of more mornings like this one. She wasn't whole. She'd never be whole, probably. Too much had been broken, too much time had passed, too many mistakes had been made, and could never be unmade. But she was more than she'd been 6 months ago. She was connected now, to Stella and tentatively to Thomas, to the past she'd tried to outrun, and the future she'd never let herself imagine. She was a mother who'd failed at mothering, but was trying to learn what that word meant beyond biology and obligation. She was a woman who'd spent 22 years in exile, but had finally found the courage to come down from her mountain. She was someone who'd kept 3 donkeys blindfolded on a journey because she'd been too afraid to let them see where they were going, only to discover that the real blindness had been her own. As she started down the trail toward town, the walking stick firm in her hand, Avis thought about what Lorraine had written in that final letter, about how everyone deserves a chance to be more than their worst mistake, about how punishment, self-imposed or otherwise, has to end sometime if there's going to be any room left for living. She'd punished herself for more than 2 decades. Maybe that was enough. Maybe it was time to try something different. Not happiness exactly, not yet, but something like acceptance. An acknowledgement that she was human, fallible, capable of both terrible mistakes and small acts of courage. That she'd hurt people she loved, but that didn't mean she was incapable of love itself. 3 donkeys had carried 3 burdens down from the mountain. Now they were free, and so, in a way she was just beginning to understand, was she. Not free from guilt or regret. Those would probably follow her the rest of her life. But free from the belief that isolation was the only answer, that running away was the only option, that the damage she'd done could never be acknowledged or addressed. She'd walked into town 6 months ago, leading 3 blindfolded animals, and people had stared and whispered and wondered what she was carrying. Now she knew the answer. She'd been carrying the weight of her own silence, and she'd been ready, finally, to set it down. The trail wound down through pine and aspen, past the creek that ran full with snowmelt, past the lightning-struck tree that marked the halfway point. It was the same trail she'd walked hundreds of times over the years, but it felt different now. Not easier, it would never be easy, but possible, navigable, a path that led somewhere instead of nowhere. And when she reached Pine Ridge, when she walked into that diner and saw Pauline look up in surprise and recognition, when she took a seat at the counter and ordered coffee and pie like she had every right to be there, she would do it with her eyes open. No more covering up, no more blindness. Just a woman who'd made mistakes and was trying, however imperfectly, to live with them. A woman who'd learned that some burdens have to be carried all the way to the end before they can be put down. A woman who'd finally understood that coming home wasn't about erasing the past. It was about having the courage to face it and still choose to keep living. The 3 donkeys had shown her the way. Now it was up to her to follow.